Paul, thanks so much for joining me on the Aave and podcast today.
Yes, so excited to take part of this.
Okay, Paul, so I know Morpho protocol is a very exciting protocol, lots going on. I think it'd be worthwhile to really help our listeners by exploring why decentralized finance protocols exist. Why should someone learn about DeFi, why these exist in the first place? So do you want to explain some of the use cases of DeFi and how the space might revolutionize the finance space?
Sure. So that's actually a question I've been asking myself for years before going into DeFi. Like, when I was into the blockchain space and the, blockchain technology specifically, and I knew about DeFi in like 2019, but just could not see myself doing it just because, it was too close to finance, which was some sort of field that repelled me for many different reasons. Like it was very negatively associated in my mind. It was a lot about speculation and I asked myself, how DeFi is different from traditional finance, and during at least 1 or 2 years, and came down to like very exciting conclusions that had me do this my full-time job. And so DeFi is about executing the code that you have inside banks on a blockchain. So the main difference is that instead of having to use your banking app that is directly connected to your bank server, you'll be using an app that is connected to a blockchain. And there are many, many changes that structural changes that comes from this. So the first one is probably transparency. Transparency in the sense that every financial execution that is performed on the blockchain is transparent because it's decentralized. So anyone can take part in it. Anyone can see what's happening. You can see where every single penny, every single coin is deposited. So it's completely transparent. The second thing is probably also resiliency. It's just like, because you can see where everything is, you get the intuition that you're less prone to systemic risk of like hiding some sort of hole in your bank that you could through banking servers, etc. But so this part seemed very appealing to me, but really what got me into DeFi and what I'm extremely excited about is first the insane cost reduction that DeFi brings compared to traditional finance. So just to get the intuition, we have to understand that you have probably more than 50,000 banking institutions, credit unions around the world. And really, they all do the same thing. It's just like they receive inputs from their users and they perform a financial service, they operate a financial service, and they do it 50,000 times redundantly. So they each have their development team, their marketing team, their execs, their buildings across the world. And you get the intuition that with DeFi, because everything is open, it's just about one open algorithm and not 50,000 of them. And this unleashes is just, you get the intuition that you're going to get an insane cost reduction out of thanks to DeFi, and that this is going to be reflected in the price of like execution of those financial services. So that would be the first, one of the two things that got me. And the second thing is like how DeFi is inevitably aligned with its users. So you get the idea that in traditional finance, people are paid to operate a financial service. So as a bank, my job is to be trustworthy and to receive an order and to make sure I execute this order without losing the funds along the way, and I execute it correctly for the user. And the user pays me to operate this and with confidence that this order will be executed. In DeFi, there is no such thing as operating a financial service to be a business, just because this is done by a smart contract. And the smart contract is like immutable code, and there's no one behind it, so it performs the service without requiring any company behind it. So it turns out that the way to sort of be part of DeFi as a company is to contribute to a DeFi protocol, so just to be paid by a DeFi protocol. And it's just very, very different incentive alignment when you think about it. It's like on one end, traditional finance, they're paid to operate a financial service on behalf of their users. In DeFi, we're paid to contribute and to upgrade a common good, which is the smart contract. And this to me was extremely powerful. And literally the day I understood this, I decided to do it my full-time, to have it become my full-time job, basically.
Yeah. And I just want to reiterate for our listeners that, a lot of the time people think, okay, how do I know this financial service, decentralized financial service, won't run away with my money, somehow steal my money? And the answer is because all the agreements, all the contracts that are written are all open source, meaning that you, as someone who uses the platform, right, you can go ahead and read that code. Obviously, you need to understand how to read the programming language that's used to write the contracts. But other than that, it's all open source. And the same is not true with your bank, right? You can't go look at exactly how your bank is managing your money. And I also want to point out that this point on innovation that you were talking about, Paul, because it's crazy when you see new DeFi protocols or new financial services being built on top of other existing financial lending, borrowing protocols already. That's a really cool innovation. Even in the case of Morpho, for example, Morpho in itself is simply an innovation by allowing people to earn more interest or pay less interest on their loans through essentially this peer-to-peer design. So I guess let's start off by exploring Morpho from a very high level. What is the Morpho protocol?
Sure. So the Morpho protocol is a lending protocol. So it enables users to lend and borrow crypto assets on chain without intermediaries. So it's like a smart contract that is going to execute the contract of doing a loan, so to lend money and earn interest, or on the opposite side, to deposit a collateral to borrow some money from the lenders and pay interest to the lenders. And it's currently the third largest on Ethereum. We have something like around $1 billion deposited in the smart contract.
Wow.
And what's different with Morpho from other lending protocols, as you mentioned, is that Morpho is built on top of other lending protocols. So it's a lending protocol that is based on top of existing lending protocols. And speaking of, coming back to the initial question, which was what's different about DeFi? This is not something you can do in traditional finance at all. And in traditional finance, the way we built Morpho is that we were looking at existing lending protocols, and because it's all open, we could see some inefficiencies in their code, and we could say, hey, okay, this is the reason why they're inefficient. Let's build something on top that is going to optimize them. So not only looking at the inefficiencies is something you can't do in traditional finance, but also building a service on top of an existing service is not something you can do in traditional finance. You have some APIs in traditional finance, but obviously, this is not as stable, and it's not does not enable as much composability as blockchain does. And so Morpho is going to be plugged on top of existing lending protocols that have rate spread. So the two main lending protocols currently are Aave and Compound. And those lending protocols have important gaps between their lending API and their borrowing API. So between the lending and the borrowing rate. So just to give an example, if you lend ETH on Aave, you'd be earning probably 1%. While if you borrow ETH, you'd be paying something like 3%. And so you get the intuition that there is 2% gap. And when I first looked into this, I was like, oh, why is there such a large gap in DeFi? I was told DeFi was more efficient, and does not seem to be the case. And really, it's very simple. It's just the way Aave and Compound are built is such that lenders are going to pool their capital into one smart contract. And so you have many, many lenders, but you have very few borrowers. And borrowers are going to pay 3%, such that 3 lenders are each going to get 1. So interests are shared across all the pools. So interest paid by borrowers are shared across all the many lenders. And to me, this design was great for multiple reasons, but also had its obvious inefficiencies. And so what Morpho is about It's about connecting borrowers and lenders peer to peer without going through the pool, such that they can earn a 2% interest. So instead of lending at 1 into the pool, I'm lending directly to a borrower at 2. And
Yeah.
instead of borrowing from the pool at 3, I'd be borrowing directly with a peer at 2. Just like if you and me were like having a loan, and you would pay 2 and I would earn 2. And so, yeah, that's the high level description of what the Morpho protocol in its current form does.
Great. Okay, so let's start off by exploring with an example how just normal pool-to-peer lending works. So let's say, for example, I'm someone who wants to borrow Ethereum and you're someone who owns Ethereum, right? What you can do is you can deposit your Ethereum into a protocol, right? This website, more or less. And through the protocol, I can borrow the Ethereum that you put in, right? And in that process, I'm going to give some type of collateral so I don't run away with your money. And also, you're going to earn some interest. So when I pay back the loan or when I take out the loan, I'm going to have to pay some interest on it. And then you make money in that process. Now, currently, how these pool-to-peer decentralized finance protocols are designed, they're designed in such a way where there always needs to be more money within the pool compared to what's being lent out to people, essentially. And that ensures an inefficient, it doesn't ensure an inefficient system, but it was a design choice that was created to ensure there's always liquidity, right? And so one of the issues is you have to pay more interest because of this design decision, which ensures there's always liquidity. So that's exactly where Morpho comes in, as you were mentioning. So do you want to walk us through an example, let's say, of someone who wants to take ETH and deposit it through Morpho, and how they can earn a little bit of interest through the matching system of this peer-to-peer design?
Yeah, sure. So we can take, just an example with you and I. So I would be the lender, you would be the borrower. And let's say I'm lending DAI and you're like borrowing DAI with ETH as collateral.
Just to reiterate there, so DAI is a USD stablecoin. You can think about it as a US dollar.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the way we work is like without Morpho, we would both go to Aave, and I would be lending my DAI at 1% APY. And you would be going to Aave and deposit your ETH as collateral to borrow, let's say like 100 DAI, and you'll be paying 3%. And the reason why is that you're going to pay me 1%, but you're going to pay also other people 1%. And so interests, again, are shared across every lender in the pool. And so Morpho would give us the ability to be connected together and say, hey, instead of paying 3, you're just going to pay 2 to me. And instead of lending 1, I'll be lending 2, but at 2%, but to you only. And that's pretty much it. And Morpho is about making this mechanism completely seamless, such that users don't really have to do anything. They just have to supply through what we call Morpho optimizer. So the Aave optimizer is like the optimized version of Aave, where you benefit from this peer-to-peer matching. But you also like have the one for Compound, etc. So if you're like using Aave, you can use Aave optimizer from Morpho to benefit from this peer-to-peer matching. And so Morpho in the protocol is all about how do we efficiently match lenders and borrowers peer-to-peer to make it work.
Yeah, and I want to just explain. So for example, myself, right? So one of the financial services I use is DeFi Saver. We had Nenad from DeFi Saver come on the podcast recently. And what you can do is you can use DeFi Saver and then through that use Morpho to earn a little bit more interest if you're someone who's providing liquidity through, let's say, Aave or Compound. So let's speak to some of the success that Morpho has had in the last year. I know since we've last spoken, Paul, there's been hundreds of millions of dollars of borrowing and lending that has been facilitated. So what are the numbers? What are the most recent numbers?
Yeah, so I think currently we're getting closer to 900 millions of dollars. So slowly getting to 1 billion
wow.
on the Morpho optimizer protocols, which is great, right? Like we launched the protocol a year ago. It's probably one of the largest DeFi growth in the space over the last year. And we're very happy with this growth. We'll probably come back to this through other questions, but I do think this growth will be limited in the long term with the current product. But I think so far we've proven that Morpho was like adding value to users that were like switching, and we initially we bootstrapped the matching engine with like emissions of Morpho tokens, and now those Morpho tokens are almost gone. And like every user we talk to is like, hey, like this is just great to use, and we're using it just because like this service is like truly useful for their use case, which is great. But again, I think like it has some limitations. It will have some limitations in the long run, and we can discuss that maybe later. But yeah, I think that's we're quite happy with the status for now.
Great. Yeah, that's really cool. And I think we should speak a little bit about this matching system and how it works, right? So just to reiterate again, so pool to peer is you put money in a pool and it's automatically lent to people. Peer to peer is involving mathematics to essentially match people directly who want to both borrow and lend cryptocurrencies. So matching the borrowers and the lenders. So Paul, do you want to explain how this matching system works?
Sure. So the general idea is that in a pool to peer system, all users are treated equally. It's just like, as a lender, I'm the same lender as everybody else. And for that reason, when someone borrows some money and pays interest, we're all going to share those interests. And so this is a very unusual behavior for a protocol or for a financial service, just because in practice, in traditional finance, it's all about having competition, like, lenders proposing better rates to make markets more efficient. But the reason why we came to have this sort of like inefficient mechanism is just due to the blockchain constraints. It's like having a pool model is extremely simple in terms of algorithmic costs. So when you're using a blockchain, you have to pay for its use, and the computation power is very costly. So you have to come up with DeFi primitives, DeFi algorithms that are able to be minimal in terms of costs. And so this is why pool-to-peer came to be. It's just like it's extremely cheap to use compared to any other alternatives in the blockchain environment. The downside, though, is that you lose efficiency. And so how do you perform peer-to-peer on-chain while benefiting from, while being able to do it like at a low cost in some sense? And so the way we've done it is basically, when I'm lending to Morpho, let's say I'm the very first lender. Well, my money is going to be deposited into Aave because there is no peer to match me with. But at the same time, I'm going to be put in a list, and my name is going to be put in the list with the amount I'm lending. Okay. And so if more lenders come in, their name will be also put in the list, right? The one after the other. And at the opposite side, you have borrowers, and borrowers can, join Morpho. And before, if there was no lender, we would have them borrow directly from the pool. But before this, we check what are the names in the list. And we're going to get like 3 or 4 names, and we're going to match this borrower with like directly with like 3 or 4 lenders. So what's going to happen is that we're going to take the money from the lenders and we're going to give it directly to the borrower, creating that peer-to-peer relationship. Now, the structure of that list can differ to make it more efficient, both in terms of like economic efficiency, like enabling more matching, but also in terms of gas. So gas being the compute unit of Ethereum, and like how much do you pay to execute a transaction on Morpho. Mm-hmm. So there is something like a trade-off between being gas efficient and being economic efficient in DeFi. And a big part of our job has been like trying to find like the most relevant peer-to-peer matching algorithm, which basically means finding the best structure to lend and borrow in peer-to-peer on. So for that list, basically, instead of having a very naive list where we put the name of everybody the one after the other, maybe we want to order them by volume, or maybe we can use a complex data structure like a tree or a logarithmic bucket to actually make it work. I can dive more into this if necessary, but just want to stop here to make sure we're on the same page.
Yeah, so I think we can tackle the the yellow paper and some of the more details of gas a little bit later on. But I want to just for a second talk about two things. So firstly, I want to just mention that the white paper that Morpho has written is an excellent document. Like, I would really encourage our listeners to check it out. It's 14, 15 pages. The examples are excellent. You can read it. You don't need to understand anything about finance, and it makes sense. And the second thing I want to mention is a little bit about this Morpho token. So lots of these DeFi protocols, for those not familiar, have a token associated with it, and it acts as an incentive for people to use the protocol. Now, in the case of Morpho, there's a token, but that token isn't actually released yet. You can't buy and sell that token on an exchange. So do you want to walk us through exactly, firstly, what this token is, why it exists, and do platforms actually need a token in the first place? What was the decision to include the token?
A token, depending on the project and the founder, founders have very different vision on their tokens, I think, in general, especially in DeFi. So like the thoughts I'm going to share are like very like personal and related to like the Morpho team only. In my opinion, tokens are a tool to decentralize ownership on certain function calls in the DeFi smart contract. Just to make it clear, in the DeFi smart contract, in the DeFi code, you're going to want to make as many things as possible automated and in the smart contract. But some things, can't be really traduced easily with math and code. And you really need like human intervention to actually be able to sort of make the right decision. And a piece of code is not able to do this. And so you could say, hey, okay, like this function could only like this parameter of like the protocol or this part of the algorithm can be handled by one man. But like then it's super centralized. So you could say, hey, let's have what we call a multi-sig wallet. So a wallet where you have multiple persons that are needing to approve in order to make the change, to operate the change. But then, it's still centralized, right? So you rely on like 3, 4, 5 people. And so tokens are a great way in the first place to decentralize this even more and gate some functions of the protocol with token holders. So token holders are able to, you can see this as an extended multisig where basically token holders can vote to make changes in the protocol. And if the vote is approved because the majority of token holders have decided to approve it, then the change is performed. And that's basically a way to, have more decentralization in some function calls that could not be directly automated by the code in some sense. So this is one thing. The second about the protocol specifically. The second thing is more about the ecosystem, and like the protocol maybe has some revenue, maybe has some treasury. This is obviously not something you can, decision regarding the treasury. It has to be something that is, tied to humans in some sense. And so tokens is also a great way to govern a treasury. Depending on the project, they have different views. Like the scope of what the token should be useful for is very different. I think in the case of Aave, for example, they're using it to make risk decision almost every day. I personally think that's a bit complicated and probably not the most appropriate thing. But every project has its own vision on like their governance and their token design in some sense. Mm-hmm. So yeah, some of them feel like it's a good way to sort of lock in the participation of other users. So it depends really on the project. For us, it's quite a minimalist approach, which is just more decentralization on some function calls that could not be automated otherwise. Yeah.
And I'm wondering, so for me, I'm trying to understand more thoroughly different types of decentralization. I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, there's only one type. It's either decentralized or it's not decentralized, at least some would argue. So myself, I'm trying to figure out, okay, does governance of a protocol make sense? Like what use cases does it really make sense in? And I guess I'm more leaning towards the idea that it actually should be as minimal as possible because frankly, if we're putting trust into people who are using these services, well, we don't know how good of the decision-making process the people who are using the protocol is. Like in some senses, I would even prefer a centralized choice where the people who have built the project are making the decisions because frankly, they know a lot more about the protocol. They quite literally built it. So I guess I'm trying to figure out exactly how voting and these DAOs should operate, and if they should operate it at all. I'm wondering if there's any decisions that can be avoided, or if there's any way around this decision-making process where it doesn't have to be the team or the users of the protocol. Maybe some other way to get around that. But I want to just go back to the matching system for just a moment, because I want to talk about its efficiency, because I think this is an important point. So how often are people actually matched peer-to-peer using the matching system?
Yeah, so I think it's for people where a matching can actually happen. So when you have like a lender and a borrower, on Morpho currently it's almost 100% of the time, just like 99 point, whatever. So it's like most of the time you'll get matched peer-to-peer if there is a counterparty. If there is no counterparty, then we can't, like Morpho cannot do magic in some sense. It's just like there is no borrower, so you're not going to do match.
Yeah,
in some sense. So yeah, that works. That works pretty well. And just a quick note on what you just said. I think it was coming back to this decentralization topic and votes. I think it's very relevant. Like in general, in DeFi we have this sort of arc where we have been wanting to give as much utility as we can to tokens, where they're probably not the most relevant engineering choice, financial engineering choice, especially on the risk management side of things. If you want, like I've written an article on this specifically, like which I call like the two paths for DeFi: decentralized brokers versus protocols. And I actually think that there are two categories of DeFi platforms. DeFi platforms that are so-called decentralized brokers, because they're literally operating like a broker in traditional finance. So someone that is operating a specific financial service on your behalf, but they do it in the decentralized way. So with an open infrastructure, which is a smart contract, and with a decentralized governance, which is through token holders. And then you have the other categories of DeFi platform, which are protocols. So like actual protocols where you have the full code that is completely trustless, general, embedded into like, the smart contract that you can't change, again, immutable. And, there is no need for like decision-making in this process, and it's just fully automated. And I do think that on the side of decentralized brokers, there are quite large incentive misalignments, at least in the current like DeFi space, where you could ask yourself, is a token holder actually the right person to take this decision or this decision? Like I could buy a bunch of like Aave tokens or Comp tokens and start voting with an important weight into risk management decisions that are infinitely complex. Like it's extremely complex to decide on the risk parameters of Aave and Compound. And by the way, they hire like companies, millions of dollars to actually do this. And so I do question the needs or the relevance of decentralization in such situation. Like I'd rather have a full expert, alone doing my fund management rather than a community of token holders that have no idea of what risk management is. So yeah, I just wanted to underline that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting question, I think. And I think time will tell actually what ends up happening in terms of this governance model and what ends up being more popular over time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so let's talk about code security and smart contract auditing. So just for our listeners, so the smart contracts are programs that are written in a programming language, and they allow things to happen on the blockchain. Send this person this amount of money at this date, send this amount of money to that person. It's a type of functionality as an example. So Morpho is a bunch of smart contracts, more or less. It's a lot of agreements written in code. And part of this is ensuring that the code is written properly, so there can't be any hacks. There aren't any what's called bugs in the code. So I know that more code has to be developed every time a new version of Aave or Compound is released, and that's developed by the Morpho team. Now, I know recently there was a bug that was detected by a white hat hacker, and so some patch was made, a change to the code essentially, not a change itself, but something on top of the code was made. And to me, this is an interesting idea, right? Because it speaks to the real risk that exists in the crypto space, which is smart contract risk, right? The fact that there might be issues with the code. So Paul, why don't you walk us through exactly what happened and how the problem was solved specifically?
Yeah, sure. So as you mentioned, like any DeFi application is written in smart contract or like Solidity language. And when doing some Solidity, you have to, test it, you have to audit it, have it peer reviewed, have it formally verified, and you deploy it on chain. And sometimes this code is going to hold like millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, even billions. And there are still some bugs in the code that are so hard to find that, still remain even after doing multiple audits. And it turns out that in the Morpho team, we have done approximately 20 different audits of our code. And Morpho, by the way, is probably one of the most audited, if not the most audited DeFi protocol in the space. Has also gone, like, for the most part of its code, through formal verification. So we have a formal verification team internally at Morpho Labs. We've released a yellow paper where we share some parts of this formal verification. So it's a big document basically formalizing the protocol, proving many properties around it. And there is no such thing as, always being completely sure about the security of a protocol. It's mainly about, using the different security techniques to make sure you cover all the bugs. So we have, testing and fuzzing. So basically, having our bullet test our code with millions and millions of random inputs to make sure it behaves correctly. We have audits, formal verification, manual formal verification, automatic formal verification. So it's a very, very long process, a very costly process for projects. And in the end, and sorry, I forgot to mention one, which is obviously white hatting. So it's like white hat is basically, you have platforms where you can say, hey, we're giving out a bunch of money to anyone who's finding a bug in our code. And with Morpho, this is what we've done, because like we know certain kind of bugs cannot be found into a 3 weeks audit. They have to be viewed for months and months and months to actually, be able to find them.
Yes.
And so I think it was 2 months ago, we were contacted by White Hat saying, hey, I might have found something that, can wreak havoc to the protocol. And so we got in touch with the White Hat. By the way, a very, very, very nice person that has been, explaining everything that is done in his research. Very impressive research, by the way, on the Morpho protocol. And said, hey, look, here, if I'm able to supply multiple hundreds of millions of dollars during a certain period of time, I might be able to steal some funds. And we're like, yeah, that's actually true. Like in that scenario, we verified it. Like we had a war room in the team, and we, with multiple auditors, we created a patch for this, and we posed the protocol and said, hey, we're going to apply a patch to fix this very bug. And so we audited this fix, and finally we imposed the protocol. So all this to say that I think DeFi in general, so just to explain how the bug was, basically, it was about manipulating Aave in order to, because Morpho is built on top of Aave, you had to manipulate Aave to have some very weird behavior with Aave that was not, taken into account into the Morpho protocol. And one thing that helped me realize this is that, so by the way, we offered as a bounty, we offered more than $200,000 of bounties for the White Hat. We've written a whole article explaining everything of what happens, and if there is a critical bug bounty, a critical bug that is found on Morpho, you can earn up to $500,000. By the way, wow. So feel free to take a look, and we encourage a lot of people to take a look at this bounty and try to find their own. So yeah, what really this event helped me realize is that building on top of a decentralized broker. So if you remember the separation, the categories I mentioned earlier before, you have decentralized brokers like Aave, where there is a very large code base, and some parts of it are controlled by the DAO, so the governance. And it's more like run like a financial service with an open infrastructure. and they upgrade the code from time to time, etc., etc. Versus Uniswap, which is like a pure protocol where it's fully immutable. You know exactly what this is going to entail, etc., etc. And building on top of decentralized broker is very complicated. It's like having a very deep integrations with Aave requires a lot. Like we're by far the very largest like protocol built on top of a decentralized broker in the DeFi space. And what we've learned throughout 2 years of building is that it's very, very hard to build on top of something that is not fully trustless in some sense, and fully immutable and well-defined, etc., etc. And so that's one of the limitations, I believe, of the current version of the Morpho protocol.
So what that reminds me of, or I guess what it makes me happy about, is the fact that you have people, researchers, as this white hat hacker was researching and found a bug in the smart contracts. Like, that in itself is remarkable, right? That people like you and I can look through the code, find a bug, get the team to fix it in a transparent way, right? That's totally new for finance, right? We don't see that currently. You know, if you have whatever bank account you have, like, that's not how these things work. So the fact that people can actually look through the code, make these changes, suggest these changes, have the team make corrections is a fascinating thing. And it really speaks to the transparency of the project, right? That anyone can look at it and feel comfortable knowing what is actually happening. So just to clarify, when a new version of a DeFi protocol such as Aave is released, right, it forces you, the team, to also produce code for that new version. So firstly, I would like you to address why new versions of DeFi protocols exist in the first place, because in theory, it would make sense to believe that there's only one version. So I think addressing why new versions exist is important, but also speak to why long-lasting code that's been around for years and years means it's typically pretty safe. So why don't you walk us through those 2 points? Sure.
So I think you have 2 reasons why you would change versions. So the first reason, so actually, like, it's the two reasons differ. Like, if we're talking about a decentralized broker, V1, V2, V3, or a protocol V1, V2, V3. In the case of a decentralized broker, so Aave V1, V2, V3, it would be more feature addition. We're not talking about paradigm shift here. It's just like, hey, Aave V2 is great, but what if we had this efficiency mode? What if we had this, extra risk parameter that is going to enable to cap what amount of an asset can be lent out? And what if we had isolation mode, this kind of things? And so Aave v3 is moving from V1 to V2 to V3 is like approximately the same mechanism, but like adding some features. In just the same way, a traditional financial platform or service would be like a broker, for example. If you look at Uniswap, it's a paradigm shift. Every new version, it's just like, I'm creating a first version of Uniswap. Okay, it can do this, and Uniswap v2 is just going to be completely different, more general. Uniswap v3 is going to be even more general, and Uniswap v4 is going to be even more general. And so what I love about Uniswap is that their ability to, every time they release a new version, it's not just about adding a feature. It's just like having a protocol that is capable of so many things, including what the previous protocol was able to do. So Uniswap v2 encompasses Uniswap v1 in itself, Uniswap v3 encompasses Uniswap v2 and v1 in itself, etc. with v4. And yeah, I think that's the main reason why. And when you're immutable, you have no choice but to create another protocol. You can't change the code.
Yeah.
Like in decentralized brokers, most of the time you can update your code to add a few things into it. In the case of protocols, you can't do that. Like you have like it's immutable code, so you have to deploy another version.
Yeah. And I want to go back to some of the actual mechanisms that Morpho uses to facilitate this lending and borrowing. But before that, I guess, yeah, it's really interesting, this immutability, and hence could explain why new versions of these products are being produced. But I also think that for a conservative person, if a person sees that new versions are constantly released, well, that means is there's potentially more bugs introduced for every single version, right? So I think there is a trade-off, right, that should be recognized. And so if you're choosing to use the V1 versus the V3, well, if there's already been years and years of, like I said, people using that version 1, well, the odds are you're pretty safe in terms of the security of those smart contracts. Okay, so let's jump into a little bit of Morpho again. So I want to walk through with an example exactly what happens with your money if you choose to lend someone money through Morpho. So I know that, for example, a loan is automatically taken out if a person decides to withdraw, if someone else is currently holding onto that money. So do you want to walk us through that process, Paul?
Yes, exactly. So this is one of the complex aspects of Morpho. So I try to make it as simple as possible.
Okay.
So, the reason, what's really special about Morpho is that it's not only able to do peer-to-peer, but it's also falling back to the pool model whenever it can't do peer-to-peer, which guarantees to the user to have at least the pool rate, at least the pool liquidity, at least the pool risk model, if it does not find a counterparty. And if it does find a counterparty, then it's just pure improvement. Better lending rates, lower borrowing rates, same liquidity, same risk parameters. So what it looks like in practice is that as a lender, and the counterintuitive thing about Morpho is that, so as a lender, if I'm the very first lender, there is no counterparty, I'm going to be lending to the pool. So if I withdraw, I'm going to withdraw from the pool. And the pool has a ton of liquidity, so I can withdraw from it. Now, in the case where there's just the two of us on the Morpho protocol, and I'm lending 100 DAI, and you're borrowing, you deposit 1 ETH as collateral. So you're the only one. So this ETH is going to be deposited into Aave, and you borrow 100 DAI. And so you're going to match me peer-to-peer. So my money is going to go to your pocket. And so if you decide to go offline at this moment in time, well, you have the counterintuition, like the intuition that there is no money, like there is no DAI. Like the DAI is in your hands, and if you decide not to repay your loan, then I can't withdraw my DAI. That was solved in the Morpho protocol by introducing the what we call the fallback mechanism, where when I click withdraw, you're not here anymore. Like you're doing some stuff with the money, you bought a car or whatever, and I'm going to click withdraw. And what the protocol is going to do is that it's going to use your ETH as collateral to borrow some DAI. So basically what's going to happen is that our peer-to-peer match is going to be broken, and you as the borrower, you'll be disconnected from me. So instead of earning 2, you'll be instead of paying 2, you'll be paying 3, because you'll be connected to the pool. And Morpho is going to borrow 100 DAI and give it to me directly. So the DAI are basically coming from the pool, so which enables Morpho to benefit from the liquidity from the pool at any moment in time. And this trick is the cornerstone of the base Morpho protocol. There are a couple of other cornerstones, actually. It was just like this one was an important trick into like, how do we make sure that as a lender, I can withdraw my money even though I'm matched peer-to-peer, basically.
Great. Okay, so let me see if I have that right. So let's say you're a depositor, right? You provide liquidity. I'm someone who's borrowing your money. So what happens is, if I borrow the money you deposited, what that means is if you decide that you want your money back and I'm doing something with your money, the collateral that I had given, right, that the loan is taken out on the collateral, which in turn pays back the money that you had lent to the protocol. Is that correct?
Yes. Exactly.
Perfect. Cool. Yeah, that is a cool cornerstone. So why don't you walk us through one or two other cornerstones of the Morpho protocol?
Sure. So the most complex one and the most interesting one at the same time is what we call the delta algorithm. So one of the biggest problems, and that's probably one of the reasons why so last year we raised like $20 million with Andreessen Horowitz and Variant and
wow,
actually 100 other investors. And during a fundraising, usually VC funds bring in engineers to basically challenge the team. And the question I got asked most of the time is just like the question they often get to is like, okay, so I'm going through this list of like peer-to-peer matching, but at some point, it's going to cost me like insane amounts of gas. So how does that work? And so the quick answer is, I'm going to supply some money. So first, I'm going to look if there are some borrowers available to match. So I'm going to match 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, 4, I'm going to spend a lot of gas. So let's stop at 4 and do the rest with the pool. If I have a very large order, this is what I would do. But the problem is, what if you're withdrawing? So you're in peer-to-peer, you want to be withdrawing your money. So you have to go through the word list. And you can't say, hey, I've spent too much gas. I'll stop unmatching me from different peers. And now I'm going to withdraw from the pool. That can't work. Just because in the smart contract, literally people that are matched peer-to-peer with you, because you're going away and not coming in, you have to erase the link, right? You can't just say, hey, I'm leaving, and there is still a link written in the smart contract. So this was a big problem for us for a long time. It's just like, how do we make sure we are able to unmatch everybody in a constant time? Because like we want to be able to limit the gas that we spent in this operation. But at the same time, you have the intuition that potentially I could be matched to 1,000 people. Like, who knows? Like, I could be matched to 10,000 people, but I can't go through 10,000 iterations. And so the delta mechanism, without going too deep into the details, introduces a way to perform a virtual equivalent of this operation in constant time. In practice, we are going to stop unmatching people after 4 or 5 iterations. And once this is finished, like, we can't perform like the 10,000 auto matches. But what we can do in constant time is to lower the rate of everybody that is still matched peer-to-peer, such that it feels like they are not matched peer-to-peer in some sense. And okay, without getting into the details, this is how we solved this sort of like gas consumption problem. And we were able to build what we call a constant time algorithm that uses peer-to-peer as much as it can, but falls back into the pool in every single scenario.
So I think in order to have people more thoroughly understand exactly the mathematics at play here and this cornerstone of Morpho, I'm going to recommend that they check out the yellow paper found at the Morpho website. Right, it's a detailed document with information from, again, more of the extensive mathematics and statistics. I was reviewing part of the yellow paper, and it had brought me back to some of my statistics courses, some painful memories. So, be warned in advance. Okay, so let's talk about the future. Let's talk about what's next for Morpho. I know there's a recent release of Morpho Aave v3, which, as we were mentioning earlier, allows people to use Morpho on this new version of Aave. So what are you looking at in terms of the future of the protocol? I know obviously it's an immutable one, but is there a new version potentially on the way, or is this something you're just constantly looking to, interact with other types of DeFi services?
Yeah, sure. So, few things. First, as I mentioned multiple times in the protocol, we in the podcast, we don't think that the current Morpho optimizer model is a sustainable model in the long term, just because it lives on top of a decentralized broker, which is too unstable for us in many different ways. And I think the path for growth for Morpho, and we've explained that in an article a few days ago, is becoming independent. And actually, this is why we're named Morpho. It's like this moment where we become independent was actually anticipated way back to the white paper, where we explain that we think that improving the rates is a great way to go to market and say, hey, like, look, Morpho is able to do better than other lending protocols while providing the same guarantees. But we knew that it's limited by the underlying lending pool itself. So it will have to morph into something that is more independent, like a butterfly. And Morpho, the name Morpho is a butterfly that, is supposed to live through this metamorphosis. And so after spending 2 years in building on top of decentralized brokers, we realized that what really DeFi lending needs is the opposite, which is a protocol, a primitive that is able to perform every single aspect of a loan completely independently from a governance. So it's like no implication of token orders into this process of taking a loan, like lending money, borrowing money. And inevitably what you do by doing this is like you have less flexibility. It's just like token orders, because they're able to change parameters every day, and they do change parameters every day, by the way, at least on the Aave protocol. Well, because they're able to do this, they earn like many benefits, which you don't have if you're a primitive lending protocol. And the end result is often that primitive protocols are going to be more complex to use. And the upside is that they're going to be much, much more efficient, much more trustless, et cetera, et cetera. And when the way I think about it is a bit more like, the Airbnb of the world, where initially you have like this very, user-friendly interface, anyone would be using it. And with time, every service is professionalizing to make it more efficient. It's just like you have actual companies that are doing this Airbnb management for you and providing this you to you as a service. And I do think this is the way DeFi will evolve in the long term, is that you'll have at the core primitives that are trustless, that are extremely efficient, and that do just one thing, that are laser focused on doing one specific thing. Just in the case of Uniswap, it's like swapping tokens. In the case of Morpho, it's just going to be lending tokens or borrowing tokens. And from this specific like core primitive, you can rebuild abstractions on top that really provide you like the automated, whatever risk managed and liquid experience that you have on Aave. But this is provided by a decentralized broker or a centralized broker, whatever, that is built on top of the core primitives. And we believe this is more complex to perform, both to design and to bootstrap. We believe in the long run is a dominant model. And this is why we are going in that direction. We've been working on this for the last 9 months. And we are going to release indeed like more into this like soon in the coming weeks, months, whatever. And so excited. There's not much I can share at the moment, but excited for this time to come to actually being able to share it to the public.
Wow, yeah, I look forward to investigating some of those new features, new designs when it's released, and hopefully I can have you on again and we can discuss some of those new primitives. Sure. So that's very exciting. And I always like when I speak to founders in the space who are really forward thinking, they're learning to iterate in different ways. Okay, they have a vision of the space and how it could be. That's great to hear, because I think one of the reasons I'm doing this podcast is to really expose the thought process of the builders like yourself in the space in a way that people can understand and try to see where the space is going. So if they can make a decision whether this is something they want to invest in, something they want to learn more about. And so it's always very exciting when we hear builders in the space excited about innovations within the space. And I get excited listening to that as well. Okay, Paul, yeah, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today. It was amazing having the opportunity to learn about the Morpho protocol and some of your experience and what you have lined up in the future.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Aave and Compound podcast. Please consider supporting it through the Make a Contribution button or the wallet address found in the video's description.